Welcome back, vintage camera lovers, for another stroll down memory stick lane, with today's episode all about the Sony Cyber-shot R1, a high-end prosumer model packing a Carl's Zeiss 5x optical zoom and a large 10 megapixel APS-C sensor. Launched in late 2005 at around $1,000, the Cyber-shot R1 was Sony's flagship prosumer camera, and while the name was new, it was arguably the spiritual successor to the previous Cyber-shot F series, packing innovative technology into an unusual body, even if it dumped the twisting design of the F505 to F828. The R1's headline feature then, and now, remains a large sensor in a fixed lens camera, something that's still a rarity today. Its potential, perceived or actual, means the R1 still commands fairly high prices on the used market, as much as $200 to $300 or pounds in working condition, although some sellers are open to negotiation, and I managed to bag one for £90. So 19 years after it was first released, join me as I take it out for a spin around Brighton to see if it lives up to its promise. The Cyber-shot R1 actually holds a special place in my heart, as it was the first review I used to launch my CameraLabs.com website back in late 2005. God, I love that left justified static HTML layout. So I'm also going to include some of my original results and sample images to see how they hold up almost 2 decades later. Now, back in late 2005, the R1 entered an extremely competitive market for prosumer photographers with $1,000 in their pocket to spend. During the previous decade, all-in-one bridge models were just about the only choice if you wanted a higher-end digital camera with a decent degree of control at this price point. But DSLRs with their larger sensors and the chance to swap lenses were becoming steadily affordable, and what cost tens of thousands in the mid to late 90s was now also available for around $1,000 or pounds. In 2003, Sony's Cyber-shot F828 faced existential threat from Canon's EOS 300D or Digital Rebel, the first consumer DSLR costing much the same. And 2 years later, the R1 found itself up against the EOS 350D or Rebel XT, which was already more refined than its predecessor. The R1 also faced future competition from Sony itself, which had already announced a partnership with Konica Minolta to develop their own DSLR, what would become the first of the Alpha series the following year in 2006. Indeed, with most camera companies releasing similarly priced DSLRs, what could the R1 do to compete? Let's find out. Like its earlier high-end all-in-ones, the R1 follows Sony's tradition of striking a canny balance between unique product design and intuitive operation. It's fair to say, apart from sharing some design DNA with earlier Sonys, there's really nothing else that looks like it, yet enough remains familiar to be up and running in moments. Weighing a fraction under a kilogram with battery, there's no getting away from the R1's heft, but once you added a kit zoom to a budget DSLR like the 350D, they're actually not that much different in overall size, and remember the R1's lens has a broader zoom range with a slightly brighter aperture. Sure, it's still heavier than a budget DSLR kit, but it never feels unwieldy in your hands, and the build quality is excellent. Interestingly, Sony abandoned the swiveling body of the previous F series, and there's still the temptation to try and twist your right hand away from you when you first pick up the R1. But while the R1's grip remains firmly fixed in position, it's large and comfortable to hold, with a considerate dip between it and the main body section for your thumb to curl around for added security. The lens barrel also rests comfortably in your left hand. In place of the old swiveling mechanism, Sony fitted the R1 with an articulated 2-inch 134K dot screen, but it's not where you'd expect to find it on the rear of the camera. Instead, it's hidden in the head of the camera, angling up first to face the subject, perhaps for selfies, before twisting 180 degrees clockwise to face you. While this now has the screen facing backwards towards the photographer, the unique aspect is being able to then fold it back down again to face upwards for comfortable waist-level shooting. Peering down to the top of the camera feels almost like composing with a classic medium format film camera, and it's one of the more unique aspects of shooting with the Cyber-shot R1. The screen articulation also lets you more easily frame at high or low angles when turned to the portrait or vertical orientation, something that was not really possible with the swiveling bodies of the earlier F series. If you prefer to compose at eye level, there's an electronic viewfinder with 235K dots, and unlike earlier models, a sensor can automatically switch between it and the screen. That said, if you're shooting at waist level with the screen, you'll want to manually select it, or your torso is going to have the camera annoyingly switching to the EVF automatically. As a prosumer all-in-one camera, you won't be surprised to be composing electronically with a screen or EVF, but previous models employed smaller CCD sensors, with the R1 actually becoming the first camera to offer live view from a large CMOS sensor at least 2 years ahead of rival DSLRs. This live view delivered not only more accurate coverage than most DSLR viewfinders at this price point, but it could also be magnified for focusing assistance, as well as displaying things like a live histogram with optional live zebra patterns if you like. Again, nothing new for a small sensor camera, but pretty groundbreaking for one with a large CMOS sensor. Pushing the monitor button during playback cycles between clean and informative views, as well as one with RGB and brightness histograms. You can play back through the viewfinder or on screen, but it does feel a bit odd to view them at the various screen angles and positions. In classic Sony style, there's no shortage of controls on the R1. On the rear, there's 2 dials positioned on either side of the thumb grip, with one clearly inspired by Canon's flat rear control wheels with satisfyingly clicky feedback. In priority or automatic modes, this wheel adjusts exposure compensation, while in manual mode it controls the aperture, and in playback the magnification. Rather than employing one of Canon's single large buttons in the middle of this wheel though, Sony's popped in a tiny clickable joystick for navigation and adjusting the focus area and position. There's also dedicated buttons on the rear to access the metering, drive modes and self-timer. The metering offers 2 multi-modes or a spot option, while drive switches between single, 3 frames per second bursts or bracketing options. Meanwhile, the 10-second self-timer is either on or off. The main mode dial feels relatively small and slightly hidden on the rear surface to the lower left of the viewfinder, when you'd normally expect it to be prominently located on the top surface of the camera. It offers the usual auto, program, manual, aperture and shutter priority modes, along with 4 scene presets. Note that playback has now been delegated to a separate button, like most DSLRs. Shutter speeds range from 0.02 of a second to 30 seconds, along with a time or bulb option, which opens the shutter with 1 push and closes it with a second push up to 3 minutes later. There's also no restrictions on the shutter and aperture combinations, unlike some earlier models, and exposure compensation is offered from plus or minus 2 EV in third stop increments. On the left side are buttons for flash and white balance options, with the latter offering auto, 5 presets and a custom option. That's pretty advanced for this kind of camera, but necessary to compete with DSLRs. There's also a rotary control switch for focus, selecting auto, macro or manual, with the latter offering a magnified live view for assistance and the chance to autofocus with a push of a button within if you prefer. Meanwhile, there's a dedicated button for ISO sensitivity located right next to the shutter release. There's a small pop-up flash above the lens and a hot shoe for mounting an external Sony flash gun, but that's now located atop the grip, since the screen occupies where you'd normally find it on the main head. Slow synchro and rear curtain modes are offered, and flash compensation is available between plus and minus 2 EV. The grip is also home to the card slots and battery compartment. Open a flap on the right hand side and you'll find slots for both Sony's own full-length memory sticks as well as Type 1 or Type 2 compact flash cards, allowing it to support the IBM microdrive with a switch to select between the desired formats. The ability to use either card format may have been introed 2 years earlier on the F828, but still felt radical for Sony. The R1 also sports FAT32 formatting for cards larger than 2 GB, but I stuck with my 2GB Memory Stick Pro Duo card in an adapter for my tests. Meanwhile, the R1's powered by the same NP-FM50 battery as the 707, 717 and 828 before it, and as an info lithium pack you can see exactly how many minutes of charge remain on screen. Now, most 20-year-old batteries refuse to accept any charge, but luckily replacement packs are readily available for popular models. I used one from DSTE, which I originally bought to power my F707, and I've linked to that one in the description. The battery is charged in camera by connecting the supplied ACL15A adapter to a DC input behind a flap on the left side. You're going to need this adapter or an optional external unit in order to charge the battery. Joining the DC input are 3.5mm AV output for TV slideshows, a standard mini USB 2 port and an accessory jack. Moving on to the lens, the R1 employs a Carl Zeiss zoom with a 35mm equivalent range of 24 to 120mm and an optically fast ratio of f2.8 to 4.8. This takes you from here to here, starting both wider and reaching comfortably longer than typical DSLR kit zooms. Of course, unlike DSLRs, the R1's lens is permanently attached to the body, but while this obviously lacks the flexibility of a true interchangeable lens system, the R1's optics do offer a more useful general purpose range than most kit zooms, which you may find sufficient. It's worth remembering that many budget DSLR owners only ever used the kit zoom, which not only had a narrower range, but a dimmer aperture. The inability to remove the lens can also be spun as a benefit, reducing the risk of dust getting onto the sensor. If the R1's range isn't sufficient though, you can attach optional 1.7x tele, 0.8x wide or macro conversion lenses. These are however quite large, especially the tele adapter, which doubles the length of the camera and adds almost an extra kilogram in weight. Like the F828 before it, the zoom is operated by a tactile, mechanically linked ring, allowing very precise adjustments. You can also screw in 67mm filters and a petal lens hood is supplied. By eliminating the mirror and prism section of a traditional DSLR, Sony was also able to implement a very short back focus, where the last optical element is positioned immediately in front of the sensor. Sony claims that this reduces the chromatic aberrations which plagued the earlier F828, and we'll see exactly whether that's the case in my sample images. In terms of focusing, the R1 offers 3 areas, cycled between by clicking the mini joystick. There's multi-area, center, and a smaller single area which can be repositioned with the joystick like the F828. The focusing itself is fairly swift for static subjects, but fares less well for those in motion. This is an area where the phase detect autofocus in the optical path of DSLRs had the edge for many years. Sadly, the R1 also lacked the hologram autofocus system of the 707, 717 and 828, which projected a pattern to focus on even in complete darkness. In its place was a simple orange LED which illuminated in dark conditions. Moving on to imaging, the most unique aspect of the R1 is of course its large CMOS sensor, one of the first times an all-in-one camera had employed a DSLR size sensor. The R1 sensor measures 21.5 by 14.4mm, so it's only fractionally smaller than those found in most budget DSLRs. Crucially though, it's considerably larger than the 8.8 by 6.6mm size of the 2/3 inch sensor in its predecessors and other high-end all-in-ones. In fact, it has over 5 times the surface area, in turn promising lower noise and higher dynamic range. We'll look at that in just a moment. The R1 sensor has 10.3 megapixels, recording 3x2 shaped images with 3 888 by 2592 pixels. This is a step up from the 6 or 8 megapixel resolution of the budget DSLRs in around 2005, and it was only matched by those rivals the following year. The large sensor also allowed Sony to implement a wide sensitivity range of 160 to 3200 ISO, which while similar to DSLRs is a significant improvement on the range of existing all-in-ones. Images can be recorded at 5 different resolutions, each with a choice of 2 JPEG compression levels. They can alternatively be recorded in Sony's SR2 RAW format, which additionally captures a JPEG at the same time, so that makes it a RAW plus JPEG mode. Best quality JPEGs measure around 4.5 meg each, while RAW files weigh in at 20.5 megabytes, and they can still be opened by modern versions of Adobe Camera Raw. The picture effects menu has been reduced to just 2 options, sepia and black and white, although the latter is an upgrade over the F series, which annoyingly excluded a monochrome option. Standard and vivid colour modes are offered along with Adobe RGB for the first time on a Sony camera. Meanwhile, saturation, contrast and sharpness can be adjusted by a notch in either direction if you prefer. While the sensor was roughly the same size as a budget DSLR, Sony was among the first to implement a CMOS design as opposed to the more established CCD technology. Now, Canon may have also adopted CMOS for its early consumer DSLRs, but what made the R1 unique was becoming the first large sensor camera to offer live view, something which wouldn't come to traditional DSLRs until the Olympus E330 or Canon EOS 40D 2 years later in 2007. Now in theory, live view could also have allowed the R1 to record video, but sadly it wasn't implemented. Maybe it was a noise, heat or power issue given the sensor was already on all the time just for composition. Perhaps it was insufficient processor or memory bandwidth. Maybe it simply wasn't considered important at that time. Whatever the reason though, it's a shame as even with inevitable restrictions, it could have given the R1 a killer edge over rival DSLRs for several years. As it stood though, the R1 was a photo camera only, which meant pitching an early large CMOS sensor with live view against a bunch of more established technologies. So let's see how it compares. Now the R1 arrived roughly between Canon's EOS 350D and 400D, so since I've already compared it against the 350D in my original review at cameralabs.com, I thought I'd go for the 400D or Rebel XT for this one. I'm also going to compare it against the previous F828 to see if the R1's bigger sensor really does deliver the upgrades that we all hoped for. Okay, let's start with coverage, with the widest view from each camera, starting with the 400D's kit zoom, which at 29mm equivalent should be the least wide on paper, but swapping it out for the 28mm equivalent of the F828 shows them to be essentially neck and neck. Note the F828's squarer aspect ratio of 4:3. Widest of all the three though is the R1 at 24mm equivalent. I'm personally very fond of this focal length, and it was unusual at the time to have it on a kit zoom or a camera with a built-in lens. Moving on to the long end of the range, the DSLR kit zoom is the weakest at 88mm equivalent. Next here's the R1, reaching comfortably further at 120mm equivalent, but the winner here by a substantial margin is the F828 at 200mm equivalent. That said, the R1's zoom range was clearly broader than rival DSLR kit lenses, wider and longer, and optically a little bit brighter too, but what real life impact does this have on portraits and close-ups? So here I am, photographed with the R1 at around 88mm equivalent in order to match the longest end of the DSLR kit zoom. Now let's take a closer look at the background blur, before flanking it with similar shots from the F828 on the left and the 400D on the right. All three were using their maximum apertures at this focal length, f2.2, f4.5 and f5.6 respectively, but do remember the different sensor sizes. Here you can see the R1 in the middle is enjoying the greatest background blur, but it's only fractionally more than the 400D's kit zoom on the right, which in turn is only a tad ahead of the F828 on the left. Now there may be visible differences if you're looking closely here, but I'd say not enough to give the R1 a decisive selling point. I think the biggest surprise for many will be seeing how close the F828 can get thanks to its brighter aperture compensating for its smaller sensor. Meanwhile, if you were to fit the DSLR with a cheap 50mm 1.8, you'd destroy both fixed lenses on background blur. What about close-up bokeh effects? Here's the R1 focusing as close as it can to the ornament when set to its longest focal length of 120mm equivalent, where the maximum aperture became f4.8. But both the F828 and 400D's kit zoom can focus closer. So here's the best case for the F828 on the left at its widest focal length, where you can get within a couple of centimeters of the subject, and on the right the DSLR kit zoom at its longest focal length, but again able to focus much closer to the subject than the R1. Interestingly, despite having very different lenses with different settings here, they're actually delivering a similar magnification on the ornament, while the closer focusing distance has enlarged those bokeh blobs in the background. You may notice both Sonys are exhibiting some onion ring patterns inside their blobs versus the DSLR kit zoom's blobs, which are cleaner inside and a bit larger overall. So overall, I was expecting the R1 to comfortably outperform the F828 in terms of background blur and shallow depth of field effects, thanks to its considerably larger sensor and fairly bright lens. But in these two examples, it may not be as decisive as you'd hoped, or even show any real benefit at all. Next for resolution, and here I tried to frame the same composition at around the 50mm focal length, matching their horizontal coverage as best I could. Let's take a closer look, and as a side note, the DSLR proved hardest to match as its optical viewfinder delivered the least accurate coverage, thereby requiring multiple adjustments and retakes. With the F828 on the left, the R1 in the middle, and the 400D on the right, you can see their respective detail and processing styles. Both Sonys share a similar style, but the 8 megapixels of the F828 are clearly being out-resolved by the pair of 10 megapixel models to its right. Now I should mention that I'm not taking into account the taller frame of the F828 here. I'm effectively taking a 3x2 shape crop from the middle by matching its horizontal coverage. But even with that said, the 828 is recording low resolution images. Meanwhile, I'd say the R1 and 400D are sharing a similar degree of real-life detail here, with the Canon on the right only looking a tad softer due to lower in-camera sharpening by default. That's something that you can adjust on either camera. Now let's move on to noise, and to measure their respective performance, I photographed this bunch of flowers at each of their ISO settings. Now this is where the large sensor of the R1 should deliver cleaner results than the smaller sensor of the F828, and hopefully roughly match the DSLR. Let's take a closer look to find out. Once again, you're looking at magnified views of the F828 on the left, the R1 in the middle, and the 400D on the right. starting here at their lowest sensitivities of 64, 160 and 100 ISO respectively. Here you can see the two larger sensor cameras looking a little softer due to lower sharpening, but cleaner than the F828 on the left, which is exhibiting a little noise even at its base sensitivity. Boosting the 828 a tad to 100 ISO increases this further. Setting them all to 200 ISO has minimal impact on the R1 and 400D, but the 828 is showing steadily greater noise. At 400 ISO, the 828 on the left continues to deteriorate, but interestingly, you'll now see some noise artifacts appearing on the R1 in the middle compared to the 400D on the right, which is still looking pretty clean. At 800 ISO, all three cameras are showing signs of deterioration, with the F828 on the left suffering the most of all. In fact, this is its maximum sensitivity. Meanwhile, the R1 in the middle may be cleaner than the 828, but it has now fallen behind the 400D on the right. The Canon may be showing some noise artifacts, but they're nowhere near as obvious here. This difference becomes even greater when increasing the two larger sensor models to 1600 ISO, where the R1 looks considerably worse than the 400D to its right. This is now the maximum sensitivity of the DSLR, but the R1 bravely offers a 3200 ISO option, which is so noisy it's really for emergency use only. These results mirror what I found when testing the R1 back in 2005. Its larger sensor is certainly much cleaner than the small sensor models which preceded it, like the F828, but it is not a match for a rival DSLR of the same period, at least at high sensitivities. Maybe the sensor technology wasn't as mature, maybe the full-time live view had a negative impact. Either way, the R1 only matched rival DSLRs on resolution and noise at low sensitivities, and it lost out as the ISO sensitivity became higher. It's also worth noting the R1's large sensor with its correspondingly large low-pass filter meant there was no way to move it out of the way to implement Sony's night shot modes of the later F series. So if you want to shoot in complete darkness or try out infrared magnet hacks, the F828 remains your best bet. Okay, now it's time for my verdict, during which I'm going to show you a bunch of images that I shot with the R1 in the present day around Brighton, but I'm also going to throw in some images that I found from my original 2005 review around London, and those also include a nice 15-second long exposure. The Cyber-shot R1 was Sony's first high-end all-in-one since the F828 2 years previously, and not only banished the purple fringing which plagued that model, but finally equipped this series with the large sensor it always deserved. Crucially, this allowed Sony to compete against the rising tide of budget DSLRs while it prepared the launch of its own Alpha series following the acquisition of Konica Minolta. The R1 was more than a stopgap though. It was very forward-thinking, becoming the first large sensor CMOS camera to deliver live view with the benefits of composing with the screen or viewfinder. Remember, this was 2005 and live view on a DSLR was still around 2 years away. But while today's market is dominated by large CMOS sensors with live view, back in 2005 it was still relatively new. I can't say whether immature technology, full-time live view or another factor was to blame, but the R1's images fell behind rival DSLRs in my tests, especially on noise at high sensitivities. This could have been compensated to some degree with the chance to record video, but Sony didn't implement it on the R1, thereby reducing its potential advantage over a similarly priced DSLR. And while the R1's zoom range was broader and more useful than the DSLR kit lens, the contrast-only autofocus made it less practical for capturing subjects in motion. Meanwhile, the lens aperture may have been a little bit brighter than a typical DSLR kit lens, but not enough to really make any meaningful difference to depth of field, at least in my tests. And indeed, once Sony launched its own Alpha series of DSLRs the following year, regular development and releases of high-end fixed lens models was essentially halted. Sony did occasionally return to the concept with the RX series, and the spiritual successor to the R1 is arguably the RX10 Mark IV from 2017. This may have employed a smaller 1-inch type sensor, but it was a thoroughly modern design with decent autofocus and greatly expanded the zoom range, and for me, remains one of their most underrated cameras. Today, models like the Fujifilm X100 series prove there's demand for fixed lens cameras with large APS-C sensors, and that's why vintage models like the R1 still command high prices. But the sensor tech in 2005 wasn't quite there yet, and like Canon's EOS 5D, I think it's more the assumption of quality rather than the actual reality which keeps their used prices high. So as much as I wanted to love the R1 then and now, I'd say it's not worth the typical prices on the used market. Unless you can bag one for less than $100 or pounds, I'd sooner have a cheaper F828 with its longer zoom, video recording, and infrared hacks. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, especially if you owned an R1 then or still shoot with one now. And if you switched from an all-in-one to a DSLR, which model turned the tide for you? Ultimately, thanks for watching another one of my vintage camera tales, and as always, if you'd like me to make more, please do follow my channel. Don't forget to click that notification bell and check out as many of my other videos here as you dare. It all really helps the small channel grow and become more viable long term. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.